in the public sphere. And so initially the project began small in Rob's class on ethnography, where I was tasked with doing a mini project with a small group of people or a large group of people, and I chose to do it with catcallers in Washington Square Park. Because I was coming out of NYU and I was catcalled and harassed there quite a bit, and my question was, why does this happen so often? What kind of impacts that has on people who experience it? And so I went and talked to them about why they do what they do. And at some point it sort of grew to a larger question about how LGBTQ people also experience harassment, precisely because I was experiencing both very sexist interactions and also very homophobic interactions. And the more my presentation changed from like a more gender conforming presence to a less gender conforming presence, then the interactions changed as well. And so in Vilna's class on qualitative methods, hi Vilna, you're in the West Coast, and she asked me to think bigger. She asked me to think about what it all means ultimately. And I remember that day I created a question of sort of how our gender and sexuality formed on the streets, and I thought that was a big enough question, but it grew even bigger after that because I started to think about violence. So the major question that I'm going to answer in this talk and through the dissertation and the book is how are catcalling and LGBTQ-directed aggression manifestations of everyday violence? That's the main phrase that I'm constructing here. That reflects widespread violence against women and LGBTQ people and maintains harmful geographies of oppression. And it's kind of a mouthful, so I'll kind of take you through it. But the method was to interview folks who catcall and harass others, to interview people, 67 of them, of recipients who receive these kinds of slurs and violence, and do a bit of an autoethnography about my own experiences with everyday violence in New York City. And so I just wanted to show you briefly the sample was very diverse and sort of representative of New York City in terms of race and ethnicity. And I was very explicit about looking for folks that are queer, that are transgender, that are of color. I made several calls for participants that ensured that I would get a variation. So you can see here, by allowing participants to self-identify instead of kind of forcing them into limited labels, I have a number of gender identities, and then folks kind of identified every other component of their life as well. So the sample is majority not straight, majority non-white, and I have a large percentage of transgender people, which makes this dissertation unique. At some point in 2016, I came across this quote, which I think really shifted the direction of my work. And Phil and I talked about writing this dissertation as a book as well, and it like really kind of put it all together for me after that conversation. And he and I randomly ran into each other in the train, and that was a pivotal moment because he allowed me to just think about it as something that I would bring to the public first and foremost when writing it. And so this is a quote that opens my dissertation in the book. It's by the Afro-Legalese on Twitter. My feminism is not about equality, it's about equity and justice. It's about individual choice and agency free from hegemonic systems. I don't want to be equal to men. Men are not the standard of humanity. I want to live on my own terms, free from violence. And it made me reconsider catcalling and LGBTQ-directed aggression as a form of violence. And the next question was how? How is it a form of violence if we have very specific definitions in society as to what constitutes it? And so in response to the way we define violence, I say that it's defined in a limited manner. So if you look at legal and criminal justice definitions of violence, they fail to sort of properly count, explain, or actually provide solutions to violence. And what that does is that it ignores a vast amount of experiences on a daily basis because there are only specific agents in society who are able to validate something as real violence or as a real hate crime. And so to sort of kind of give you my theoretical framework, I looked to sociology of gender and sexuality. I looked to LGBTQ studies, where I finished a concentration. I looked to women's studies, where I finished a certificate and used intersectionality. I started to think of myself as a queer geographer because there was quite a lot in queer and trans geography to help me think about violence as both a continuum and pervasive across society and pervasive across systems, sort of spaces, as well as kind of history. And so I started to develop another phrase called linked violence, which I'll get back to later at the end of the book. Just to help myself make both horizontal and vertical connections between different types of violence, or as Matt commented, between privatized violence and public violence. So to move into the findings, at first, I mean, it became obvious to me after doing all my interviews and my analysis, which took many years, that these are kinds of forms of everyday violence, which scholar Elizabeth Stanko gave to us as a term, I think in 1990. She's a UK criminologist. And she was really talking about the fear women have of being in the public sphere and what kind of violence takes place, both from just kind of harassment to being mugged to being raped. And she had her book, also entitled Everyday Violence, really only talk about the two mainstream genders, men and women. And she really made an explicit distinction between the public and the private sphere, which you know, white feminists tend to do. And that's not a very easy distinction to make for other people. And so I understood that it shapes gender and sexuality for everybody involved, people who harass, people who get harassed, bystanders, for my own self as a researcher. And of course, the favorite word academics have is co-constituted. I had to put that in there as a shout out, because that's what intersectionality implies, that gender and sexuality, race, class, space, and many other social factors and systems intersect. And it's not so much about identity, but it's about experiences of oppression. And so when I started to think about who harasses and who my sort of initiators were, I think one of the first questions I had for them was, what do you think about the fact that people often say it's just Black and Latinx men who harass? Or what do you think about the fact that only construction workers harass? Why do you harass? What do you think about that? And so they knew that there are these pervasive racist and classist stereotypes. And that has a really long history and a really long legacy that I've written about, because it gives you a very easy scapegoat for who perpetrates violence as opposed to who allows it to happen in society. And those two groups are very different. One is a group of men of color who have very little power and who work outside, and another group, the group that allows violence to be perpetrated in society, are white men who are sort of behind benches and are cops and are judges and are politicians and so on. So that being said, because these men harassed, I still wanted to know exactly how that worked, and so I started to develop the anatomy of everyday violence. Turns out, to no one's shock in women's studies, is that when you add toxic masculinity ideas with ideas that everybody is straight or available to you for your pleasure, makes for a dangerous mix. So the more that initiators feel traditional gender norms are the right way to go, or the more they feel entitled to bodies in public space, the more likely they are to kind of participate in this. And I can talk a little bit more about exactly how the anatomy of everyday violence works from their perspectives. But more importantly, for me, it at some point mattered more what the impact of these interactions is on the recipients. And so, of course, there's short-term effects, which are pretty significant. I want to talk more about how there aren't any strategies that I can recommend. Often students ask, so how do we stop it? What's the best thing to do? There's all these strategies recommended, like self-defense classes, carry mace, I don't know. And my research shows that mostly they're quite unsuccessful, but I can tell you that to de-escalate the violence, it works best to just pacify it to some extent instead of ignoring it or saying no. So one of the most dangerous things that actually shows how this is a form of violence is that when rejected, catcallers and harassers escalate their violence. And so people sort of walk around with the threat of that happening, whether it has happened to them or to someone they know. It's violence not only because it happens all the time, not only because it's cumulative, but also because of the threat of greater violence that the interaction carries within itself. The cumulative effects, however, are very, very significant, and I don't just mean that people move neighborhoods, change jobs, change their gender presentation, rethink their sexuality, rethink their trauma. It's that it has a real kind of weathering on the body, which brings me to the realm of public health and the effects of both racism, sexism, and homophobia and transphobia on people's bodies and psyches. So one of the ways that people talk about this is both that smaller experiences of violence on a daily basis trigger their previous experiences of sexual assault and trauma at home, in school, and their workplace. And also that they say a person is 45 years old, they've carried quite a lot of these experiences and they've accumulated. And I don't know what that accumulation, how we can measure that accumulation. It's just something people can kind of describe in different ways, and they have. For people who are queer, which is kind of my next point, it's a little bit different to talk about the experience of everyday violence, because if a straight woman faces catcalling or is put in her place in the public sphere, she can still find validation for her identities in private. She can find validation through marriage, through being represented in the media, and so on. But queer people often rely on public spaces as the only place where they can be LGBTQ and themselves, because they're often abandoned at home and at school, and also have like a lot of trouble with gainful employment. Okay, so when I talked about queer people in my dissertation, I kind of talked about visibility and invisibility, because some of us can be visibly queer and some of us are not able to safely be that. And also there are assumptions in the public sphere about who is queer. And so actually, folks experience everyday violence regardless of being a lesbian or being trans, just by the initiator's perceptions of them as being queer or being trans. And so a lot of straight women in my sample would say that when they were walking next to their best friend or something, they had a bottle thrown at their head because someone thought they were together. And so it's actually not about your authentic selves anyway. It's really about whether or not other people attribute to you a gender and sexuality, which in sociology we already know because there's gender attribution. And that's something that my students never really understand because they think of it as more of a private matter, but it's actually something that others have to agree upon or decide for you. And so the interactions in the public sphere reveal to us that gender and sexuality, as well as any number of other factors, are actually socially constructed. And so that's why the diversity we actually have in our communities is never reflected in the public sphere. It's people are either assumed to be gay or straight, and they're assumed to be men or women. And that erases folks who are bi, folks who are asexual, folks who are polyamorous, folks who have any number of identities, hundreds of identities. And I think one of the most insidious things about this is that it makes it appear as if there's more straight and cisgender people than there are, when actually just in this room alone, it's a largely queer and also trans presence, and you simply wouldn't know it. I'm a trans person, there's other trans people here. And so that's kind of one of the evils to me of having public space be a very heterosexist place. The word heterosexist means that it's a place where straight people can be validated and can navigate more easily. Queer people have to come up with adjustments. They have to talk about being able to pass or being stealth or, carrying clothes to the club and wearing something else. So like when I go to Tango, I put on a whole one outfit, and then at Tango put on a femininity that I cannot walk through New York City at this moment, and it's 2019. And so it continues to remind me as a 35-year-old person that I do not have access to public spaces in the same way that others do. And certainly as a lesbian, I do not have that similar access. Of course, I'm a white lesbian, so that provides me quite a bit of privilege and power and protection in society. So to speak of queer people of color, trans people of color, we're getting into violence that even the FBI considers real violence, because we're talking murder, we're talking rape, we're talking serious danger. Of course, the FBI doesn't really care to address that violence, but it considers it, I guess. And so, moving into a chapter specifically devoted to transgender people, because LGBTQ does not mean sexual minorities. some of the letters in that acronym do, and the T stands for transgender people, which is a gender minority. So I needed to pull out that sample, 16 people, and kind of talk about the way they experience this toxicity, which is a term I coined, to describe both the city made toxic by everyday violence, and shout out to Zahn, who actually helped me with the term. But anyway, always give credit to people that helped you become the scholar you are. And so it's this kind of toxicity, and it's a city that's made toxic by cisgender people on trans people. And so that actually gets more complicated because it's not very easy to create victims and perpetrators in this case, because you do then have to attend to how cisgender people who are queer can also be a danger to people who are transgender. And so that means that women and other people can also be perpetrators of violence. And so whenever people think about the conversation as only a gender conversation with very clear villains and very clear victims, this actually moves us away from that into something far more complicated. So in the chapter, I sort of talked about how trans people can figure out their strategies and how they're distinct, even if some of their experiences overlap with other women, for example. Their experiences are distinct. And to give you an example, a person who may pass as a woman to others would have it all be put into question if they spoke. Because sometimes people have deeper voices, and that puts them in greater danger than someone like me who can say, like, fuck you, and, you know, not put my body and gender in danger to that extent. So you remember I told you that one of the things that we use to pacify violence is to engage, and so maybe smile, maybe giggle, maybe give a phone number. Trans women are not able to do that. So that strategy is out from the very beginning for them, okay, because of this. And so the other thing I started to think about was how queer and trans people are asked to decide or to choose their loyalties to being queer and trans or to being of color or their cultures or their ethnicities. Because when I looked at what gentrification has to do with this process, how to link criminalizing processes, police brutality into my work, I started to see that folks who are multiply marginalized always have to either be in spaces that are largely white in order to find acceptance for their queerness or transness, or be in neighborhoods that protects them from white people and whiteness and white supremacy, but not be as accepted for their queerness and their transness. And so I started to term like this queer versus POC loyalty, and it's not that simple, of course, and there are spaces where you can try to reconcile all of your identities, but gentrification contributes in very negative ways to this. And how? So the process of gentrification, as you all know, is the displacement of people of color and lower income folks by white people who come in, and there's like different waves of gentrification involving corporations, involving real estate, involving politics, whatever. And part of how this looks like for my micro interactions on a daily basis is that when people are coming into a neighborhood, sometimes men, for example, respond with sexism and homophobia and transphobia. But what they're actually doing is expressing their displeasure with being displaced. And so a lot of my white gentrifier recipients would talk about how I showed up and now they say, we don't want this shit on our block, that's white people shit. When in fact, the reality is that queer and trans folks, whichever terminology they rely on, of color are indigenous to those areas. And so making that distinction between how queerness and being trans is for white people only makes those other more marginalized people lose out. Okay, so that violence to me is linked, the violence of gentrification and everyday violence. What about criminalization? Well, I started to do this kind of global international research about what people are trying to do on a more policy level. And lots of countries at the moment are trying to criminalize catcalling as a gender-based hate crime, what have you, whatever. There's different fines, there's different criminal punishment. There's 6 months in jail in the Philippines, I believe. I think there's a first person who was put in prison for catcalling. And so as a scholar, as an expert on this kind of interaction, I'm asked all the time what my take is. And so I'm going to say that my take is decidedly anti-criminalizing the behavior because it'll give another avenue to folks like NYPD who already target very marginalized communities to abuse and to simply put black men, Latinx men, men who are doing work on the street into prison. Also because prisons don't solve violence and are hotbeds of sexual violence, and they actually escalate violence and don't offer any kind of solutions. So prison abolition, I know it seems like a utopian idea, but there was a time when there were no prisons and there was no NYPD, and that time can come again. Restorative justice is a concept that talks about how do we hold people accountable instead of talking about these interactions as an interaction between individuals. So we need to talk about this as a public health problem, and that's one. And two, we have to talk about this as a problem that we all make possible. And so in order for it to be eradicated, which I hope you all agree it must, we have to work as communities. But as I recently pointed out, gentrification breaks up communities. It breaks up rootedness, it breaks up belonging, and that makes it difficult to have a united community to work through even generational trauma. And so while restorative and transformative justice is so important, if neighborhoods are constantly shifting due to other processes that are violent, I can't imagine if you were to raise a generation that it would stay kind of, focused on that. But Girls for Gender Equity, for example, in Brooklyn is a great organization that talks to teenagers of all genders about stopping engaging in these sorts of interactions. And I love what they do because I do think it's about talking to younger people and talking to adults and talking to politicians and whatever, but it's not about criminalizing it. So I created a model of everyday violence, which I'm about to show you, just so that other scholars can rely on it. And I wanted to say that doing intersectional work, aside from actually focusing on people of color, which I think lots of folks forget, you can include and incorporate other factors like religion. And so let's look at the model. The model of everyday violence that I developed is a model that has flexibility in it to move the pieces around. So you already know that it's a process, first and foremost, that lasts a life course between initiators and recipients. That it largely moves from cishet men, cisgender and heterosexual men, against women and LGBTQ people, and sometimes recipients respond back with violence when they are racist in turn, when they're classist in turn, when one of the only things they can do, I guess, is rely on some of those other forms of violence, and so that's why the arrow is also going back. And primarily I chose gender and sexuality to think through the process affecting, but it also affects the process. Of course, it's our ideas about gender and sexuality that allow for this to happen in the first place, but also once the process of everyday violence takes place, it reshapes our ideas of gender and sexuality. And of course there's effects, short-term, long-term effects, and I told you that it's co-constituted by race, class, and space, and on the other side by community, neighborhood, and state. So these are more structural levels that I'm thinking about. Community in terms of justice, neighborhood in terms of gentrification, state in terms of criminalizing and policies. You see that little factor thing over there? There could be many of those, but one that I included in my work was religion. Oop. So my final chapter prior to the conclusion was really talking about folks who were raised Christian and the way they are folks who are Black, who are raised Christian, who are LGBTQ, and the way experiencing everyday violence in the public sphere changed their religious paths and their non-religious paths. And combining something like religion with the urban sphere, with gender and sexuality, is not done. And so this was something useful for educators throughout the world. I had someone from Prague reach out to say that this is the first example of scholarship that spatializes a spiritual path and spatializes for us like how you can move through a neighborhood and it can remind you of a certain culture of religion, of the homophobia that you were raised with through religion. So that's a great article. It's called Straight Gods, White Devils, and it really gets at the tension for Black people between their race and their sexuality and their gender identity. So overall, for me, the significance of this project goes beyond urban sociology, women's studies, and LGBTQ studies. If you want to really think through religion, community, and what constitutes justice, it's pretty good for that. I talked about how everyday violence is actually a public health crisis instead of something I suffer with alone, moving us into the health sciences. This is good for urban sociology and anyone really that talks about gentrification in neighborhoods because, well, in that particular subfield, there's very few scholars who really think about how gender and sexuality is formed by space. And definitely not thinking about what I termed queer gentrification, or following other scholars. And of course it also works for criminology when a criminologist who does work on street harassment, Laura Logan, thought and read through my work. She said, you can really consider this as critical criminology, and kind of, pitch it that way. Carceral feminism is interesting. The work speaks against it. Carceral feminism is feminism where white women who are quite privileged kind of applaud criminalized solutions and applaud this becoming a hate crime. And they don't have a really good idea of how hate crime legislation actually hurts LGBTQ people and will hurt women. So at this point, I have some articles under review with Journal of Lesbian Studies and Sociological Inquiry. I published my introduction in a book on how to do deeply personal research. I pitched the book already last year, but they all said to graduate first. But it helped me finish the book with the comments from editors. And so that was still a good move. And I think I'm going to probably go with Rutgers because I really like the editor. As for the future direction, some things that I'm thinking through is to really interrogate disability quite a bit more. Disability both physical, mental, disability both visible and invisible, chronic and whatever, because another kind of really insidious thing about that is you can talk to me about experiences of catcalling, but if you talk to a blind person about experiences of catcalling, it requires a completely different lens. If you talk to my deaf friend, it requires a completely different lens, because you remember, she can't even hear that it's taking place, which is understood by the harasser as ignoring it, and so it's really actually very dangerous. And so I would then focus an entire book project on disabled communities, folks who are of course still LGBTQ, trans, of color, whatever, and also can talk me through their disability. And of course when you think about mental illness, there's any other number of ways that anonymous interactions with strangers could impact you truly very negatively. This moment, I'd like to say thank you to my committee. I'd like to thank Rati for keeping me in this place, my friends and my students who are here, and my wife, who did not help type this on a typewriter. Okay, thank you.
Okay, procedure is that we're going to all ask questions, and then we'll open it up for you folks to ask questions. Then we'll adjourn to a private space to talk about it, and then we'll bring Simone in and talk more to her. And I guess in the interest of etiquette, since Matt is the visitor to the department, we should start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone. So I have a question about, there's so much confusion as part of this process of violence, right? So not only is the everyday violence seems to be separate from real violence, right? So that's a confusion. Mm-hmm. You try to straighten out the confusion by linking them.
Yep. But
there's so much confusion in the interactions themselves. I look at you and I think you're straight, so I catcall. And I say one thing. I look at you and I think you're a lesbian, so I say a different thing. But I don't know, right? And I think you call it, there's a sociological term for this. I didn't know. Identity attribution?
Gender attribution.
Gender attribution.
Mm-hmm.
But they're just like multiple levels of confusion. And yet, heterosexism seems to be able to make order out of all of that confusion, rather than to be unsettled by it, right? Because it's this, and almost, I want to say that you use the term hegemonic masculinity, has the power to promote all that confusion, but ultimately, in the end, absorb it for its own uses. And so, I guess my question is just about the systemic nature.
Okay.
That relies not on systems of order and clear meaning making, but on confusion. And so what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's fascinating, but also helps me explain to students that while there's certain clear rules in the workplace or at an educational setting, it's the streets with this confusion that really tell us what positions we hold in society. So when you're confused about your status and where you fall, something like an experience of everyday violence can really expose for you that in fact you're not equal. So that's one thing I'm thinking. The other thing I'm thinking is, yeah, of course there's lots of like assumptions being made, but there are some groups who are allowed to make assumptions of all kinds and other groups who are not. So it doesn't really work in reverse as much as men say. When they say, oh, I would love to be catcalled. Well, that's a very different thing from I don't want to be catcalled. So it doesn't even make sense that you would ask for that reverse kind of process. But also, yeah, well, hegemonic masculinity is called hegemonic for a reason because hegemony implies an overall grand narrative. And that also means for me linking it to other spheres in society, because if you look to any other sphere, the home, again, I just belabor this point because a person can have a day where they experience domestic violence, go to school, experience harassment there, then be on the street, experience violence there, and then also experience it at work. And so it's actually, it's not just that it's linked. I think it just spills into one another, and then it provides this like hegemonic narrative. But I can't say that it's just hegemonic masculinity and heterosexism over, for example, white supremacy or the cisgendering of reality. I mean, I'm not interested in figuring out what's most salient. I am, however, interested in figuring out who does it most often and who receives it most often. And of course, there's all this other complexity, like masculine lesbians, for example, harass more feminine queer women. Like all of this other stuff that you could bring and say negates some of this, but it doesn't. It just simply is the variation of experience, and you'd have to look at these things very carefully, but there is a large pattern of like, yeah, it's men doing it, and they do it both to express their desire and their power, and they do it to police the public sphere and erase deviant elements from it. And that's because they are so condoned and so validated by others to do.
Thank you.
Any further?
Well, I think that.
Look at all the colored Post-its he's got. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, most of this is just, sort of, I'm fascinated, and I just want to say I appreciate what you did at the end with disability, because I see that as an incredible avenue to go, but I see many other avenues to go, and I think the development, so the development of the term
Toxicity.
toxicity. Visually captures that. I just want to sort of applaud that. That visually captures, right, the intricate nature of how the system overlaps.
Yeah.
So,
Language.
kudos there.
Thank you.
But that's it.
Okay. I think I've been reading this all along. We've had millions of comments. We've had discussions. So let's just take and move on. And I'm going to sound a little crazy, I think, partly because I just am the jet lag and the scenic home. But I want to place this in a larger context. And having just spent a month in Finland, there's a lot I've been thinking about. So this must be the happiest country in the world.
Supposedly.
Not obvious being there. No, I mean it. And they've got all the services. It's like they won the lottery. But there's some real issues. There's a lot of private violence, a lot of private domestic violence. They have the highest rate of rape and some other stuff in large part, whatever. I don't remember the numbers. But it all looks good on the street. So one of the things I was thinking about was the larger issue of street interaction. The Finns make jokes about the fact that if two people are waiting for a bus and a third person comes up, they have to space themselves because nobody wants to be next to anybody. And just when I was first reading this, I was thinking, how much is New York and how different life is in Boston? You know. And now I'm really thinking about it. In New York, if I am at the bottom of the subway steps with gray hair and a heavy suitcase. Somebody comes along within a minute and carries it up for me. If I am in Boston, you could die at the bottom of the suitcase, okay? It's a cultural difference. Finland, much to my surprise, you could die at the bottom of the staircase. Because people won't say, you okay? Which in New York, people will see somebody walking around with tears in their eyes and say, are you okay? The what about, this is the bad part of public freedom to interact, but much to my, maybe I'm sounding crazy, but there's actually a good part to a lot of public street interaction. That if I walk down the street in pain in New York, I'm not kidding, somebody, you get tears running down your face, somebody will ask you if you're okay. We talk about never getting a seat on the subway, but it's nothing compared to plenty of other places I've been. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't think in larger terms about street culture, street life, levels of acceptable interaction, and can you clamp down this one without clamping down the others? It's part of what we're seeing in the Me Too. If you look upset and I go to put my arm around you now, I'm thinking, oh shit, you know? Is it okay? I fell on my bike a couple of months ago, and I was okay, but I was like shaken, and a young woman stopped and, you know, like was checking I was all right, and then said, can I touch you? And I was like, yes. I just needed somebody to hold my hand for a second and help me find my shoes. So the general cutting back on public interaction, on public affection, amusement, anything, I'm just a little concerned or thinking or trying to understand.
Okay, great.
Well, can I
Sure.
piggyback on that too? Because you kind of got to some of this irony, though in a very specific way, when you were talking about communities, particularly communities of color, but traditional working class communities, in which, on the one hand, there may be that very public interaction may be providing protection and solidarity within, for certain, you know, either within a racial or class concept of community, while at the same time it's also promoting the marginalization of people who are seen as deviant in that community for whatever reason, right? And then, you know, sometimes the opposite would be true. The same person who leaves that community and then goes to a community in which queer behavior is more acceptable on the street, but it's predominantly white, you know, may feel fine in expressing the queer thing, but suddenly find themselves being harassed for racial or class reasons. So, you know, part of this is that I think one of the things that you're struggling with here is the fact that communities of public life and lots of public participation, you know, how do you take bits and pieces of that without, I mean, because the obvious thing which you're trying to avoid, I think, when you talk about not doing this with legal sanction, is the fact that, well, there's one obvious answer, which is the Finnish answer, right? Nobody ever talked to anybody, you know, let's have very strict rules of decorum in public. Most of us don't want to go there, right? But, you know, if not, then what do you do in terms of being able to create a world that's more accepting on the one hand, without losing the solidarities on the other?
Okay, I'm going to handle all of this.
Okay.
From start to finish. So actually the first thing I thought about when you talked Finland versus New York was just how much variation there is across the world in terms of street harassment or everyday violence and across the United States. So like one other avenue of future work is to kind of compare rural versus suburban versus whatever. Do we have public transportation? Do we have cars? You know, because people have these really easy assumptions about how this is a city problem, but it's not. It just looks different. It mutates across different places and spaces. The other thing I keep thinking about is the long history urban sociologists have of exalting New York City life and city life, because these were all white men who felt able to traverse all the neighborhoods and just kind of take their pick, and talked about stoop culture and this culture and whatever. Now you're being helped because, you know, you're looked on as someone with privilege. Like there is another woman who could just as easily be abandoned with a suitcase in New York City. And so it's really about like who people help. On the other hand, it's about the difference between a woman reaching out to you and asking, can I touch you, and someone doing something unsolicited, like a man helping you with a suitcase to then ask you for something else, you know?
I think we're not quite talking about the same thing here.
Okay.
I think what I am seeing is that I don't see anybody stuck at the bottom of the subway steps with a heavy thing as long in New York, not
As in Finland.
as in Finland or Boston, and which is just like, I don't understand that, but it's a thing. But I think there are variations in that norm that need to be appreciated that are not entirely about position of privilege.
Mhm.
And I think we really need to acknowledge an understanding of public life
Okay.
as not
It's not
entirely
about
always used from the interest of privilege, blah, 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 blah. If I had to be a poor person of color in a wheelchair, blah, 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 I'd rather do it in New York than a dozen other cities that I've been
Well,
in. In terms of social services, move me to Finland, though no ramps, so never mind the wheelchair. I mean, I think
There are
that
no ramps in Finland.
there's disability stuff, which is what I was there, but whatever.
Okay.
They have a 90% abortion rate for Down syndrome. I mean, it's a whole other world. But I just think these issues need to be understood in without one canceling out
Okay,
the other.
yeah. All right, so what a lot of my participants sought throughout their lives by moving to different places is community, is a sense of neighborhood culture, is a sense of public life. It's really about whether or not they can access that public life the way other people enjoy it, for example. So people really do want to say hello, to know who their bodega owner is and versus like who their, you know, people in the neighborhood is, and they all mentioned that they wanted to move someplace for the community, and then it was sort of a lesson in how they can't fully enjoy it, I guess. But when I talk about community justice or transformative justice relying on communities, I think communities together have to redefine what community is.
Yeah.
You know, like we all have to come together and say we will enjoy helping each other with no ulterior motives. We will enjoy, you know, saying hello and good morning with no ulterior motives. I think public life is great. Like, I'm a New Yorker and a snob, you know, and love that here. I love that I can interact with many people, but it has to be with consent. So I think public life and participation in public life has to be desired and wanted, and people do really want it. In across all neighborhoods, but it's just really unfortunate sometimes. So yeah, I'm all for public life and for public spaces, all at the same time as these spaces are threatened, destroyed, public
Right.
parks, and just spaces in general become privatized. So yeah, I don't know. I don't want to cancel it out. No.
Yeah, well, and that's, since Barbara has been stereotypical about the Finns and the Bostonians, I will jump in and say what is almost certainly an overly stereotypical remark, but I can't imagine a better place to be stuck at the bottom of the tram stairs and have the suitcase in my hand than Southern Italy. And I can't imagine a worse place to be a young woman walking through public streets
It's
at
true.
night than Southern Italy.
In Italy, yeah.
You know, those two things, I mean, you know, the levels of daily catcall harassment, again, this may be somewhat stereotypical, but in Southern Italy, that's huge, and it's and there's debates about it, and people who raise issues of it are totally dismissed. And yet at the same time, that comes with a very rich, if, you know, you fall down in the street in Italy, 12 people will run over to pick you up. I mean, without, and this happens in working class neighborhoods, this happens to people who are visible minorities, you know, I mean, it's just what you do, you know. Doesn't mean that they love those people, doesn't mean that they won't be racist against those people in other contexts, but that's just what you do, because you're in public life.
And I do see
And
that.
do those things
people-
go together is the problem. And how do we separate them?
Right. Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah. Barbara, do you have other?
No, that was a
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, and that does get, I don't get Robert one second, but I'm gonna say that does get to, I think, where you're still, because you see all the complexities, and because you're good at writing about complexity and not trying to reduce this to one thing or another, you end up in that well, this goes in this direction, and this goes in that direction, and this goes in this direction. I think you're still dancing around about this community question, particularly when it comes to things like gentrification, right? Because, what we don't want, or what you don't want, is the sterility that could be imposed by conformity. But on the other hand, you do want people to conform to certain norms. And those should rise out of the community.
Yeah.
But the community sometimes
Disagrees.
Yeah, exactly. And the community is sometimes racist. And if the community isn't racist, sometimes it's sexist. And sometimes it's homophobic.
Right. Exactly.
So, and the norms that rise from the community could be deeply problematic. So, you do seem to be kind of dancing around exactly what the norm is. You know what you don't want, which is either rampant harassment and violence or the repression of rampant harassment and violence by ultimate conformity, right? And, okay, we can all agree those are both bad outcomes. So I'm not quite sure what the good outcome is.
I agree. I think when I read, it's kind of how I read about communism or anarchism by our leaders, where there's not a very clear sense of how this is supposed to look like, even though it's good in theory. And it's never been played out all that well, because when I read about transformative justice, it also still feels quite abstract.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I'm dancing around it; it's just the people I'm dancing with are also are also really struggling with what that could look like if you were to move away from this monolithic idea of community. And so they talk about it as, well, queer people have always talked about it as fleeting and like momentary anyhow. So that's easier for me to do as a queer geographer, but like for other people who really do think it's more static or located in a place, gentrification makes that difficult. But again, if we ask the most impacted people first what some of those social norms would be, I don't particularly care if men feel sterilized or sanitized from engaging in this behavior, because my politic is to focus on the most impacted people. So like if I say, and I do, like, please do not murder trans women,
Yeah.
and they feel like, well, trans people are not a thing, that I don't care. It takes precedence that you're murdering folks based on your ideas of gender. So if we all gather together, the way I run the classroom wouldn't be everyone here has a valid opinion. I would say everyone here with a lived experience of this inequality goes and talks to me first, and then we create norms. So how are norms created? When I think about this, I think it's a household conversation first and foremost, and then a community conversation. And a lot of the time, for certain communities, that household convo takes place outside, amongst mothers, amongst men, because they all engage in this as a group, actually. So it's a group activity. But when I asked people, like, how did your parents react, it wasn't so much that they talked about their fathers who were engaging in this experience, in this kind of interaction. It's that it was ignored by their mothers. So I think there's a how do we reproduce these values? How do we first dismiss it when it takes place privately, and then of course it gets dismissed when it takes place in the public sphere. So like parents would have to have these conversations, and I asked, this is another thing I didn't put here, I asked, what would you say to your 12-year-old daughter who says she's experiencing it for the first time, and what would you say if you saw your 12-year-old son doing it? And I have like a whole article out of that didn't go into the dissertation, because every single participant was completely lost as to what they would say. But more importantly, they didn't know what strategies to offer to the daughter because they had none themselves. But as far as their son, they were like, I would be like, you can't do that to people. People are human beings. They have autonomy. You should watch boundaries, like all this good stuff. So it's like they have the idea of what public life should be like, that people aren't porous, that pregnant people, disabled people, queer people, women, they're not for public consumption. They're just in public with you, and you're sharing that space. And so that would be some other secondary thing where I said the space is shared. How can we coexist? I guess. Without, but the thing is that there are already people, the disabled, folks who can't handle the impact of this. They are staying inside.
Right.
So it actually looks like the public sphere is just skewed, because not everybody is there. It's like not everyone's in my classroom because folks don't go to college and can't access it. So it just looks weird. So we're very lucky to have access to the public sphere in that way. every day.
Yeah, I think that, again, and I appreciate the difficulty of the situation,
Yeah.
but the way you've set it out is, what do you say, a group of African American men
Mm-hmm.
are harassing in a gentrifying neighborhood
Mm-hmm.
who feel they're being displaced
Mhm.
legitimately
Mm-hmm.
and feel they're being over-policed
Yep.
legitimately,
Right.
and express that by taking it out on a trans woman or a queer woman or an upper class appearing white woman who's
Right.
just moved in,
Correct.
a la, do the right thing, who's just bought the brownstone next
Right.
door and is displacing people. What's that, but is using very much catcalling,
Yes.
sexual harassment terms in order to
Correct.
do that,
Correct.
right? And this happens in your stuff all the time,
Yes.
right? Which is one of the things I like about it is you don't shy away from that. You
No.
say, okay, that goes on.
That happens.
That happens. So what do we say to them?
And you know what? I want to jump in. I've been very silent so far. I'm on the same page with Phil on this. You get a lot of credit from me from the fact that you didn't pull your data, that you showed us everything. I mean, I don't know what you didn't show us, but everything you showed us, it looked like you weren't.
a lot.
You weren't whitewashing it, right?
Correct.
So I thought that's really good, because social scientists should analyze their data.
Yes.
I do think, though, that like in the treatment of some of these kind of interactions, you sort of, and this is the first time I'm speaking, and it's the hardest point I'm going to make.
No worries.
You've got this feminist ethnography commitment, right, to center and respect the subjects. But when you talked about the Latina woman and the white woman being harassed, you were like, the problem with their stories is that it backs up the myth. You didn't analyze them at all. You sort of just flew them off. I have it in the notes here.
Okay.
Mermaid and somebody else.
Okay.
I have it written down. It's all notated, so you won't lose anything.
Okay, great.
And we can meet after. But you just sort of like, well, the problem with their story is this, but you didn't pause to analyze it, and you didn't situate it. And I think, and it's not like you didn't then go on to talk about the things that Phil's talking about, right, with gentrification. Like, people have reason to be angry if other kinds of people are moving into their neighborhood and they feel like their place in their home neighborhood is jeopardized, right? But I do think that you need to figure out how you're going to deal respectfully and fully with the stories that those women are telling, even if you don't like the political implications. Like the thing with Hollaback's film, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know how, this is another actually empirical point. I believe you that there's like this myth that it's only black and Latino men that do this, right? My question was, is there data on this? Like, do people, and if you don't, it's okay for you to go on what the dominant stories are, right?
Sure.
But if there's data on what do most people think, and then what actually happens, I would love to see some of that right in the front of the dissertation, the book. Like there must be surveys or something else. Some quantizoid must have done something about this. If not, then it's okay for you to assert it as the dominant belief. I'm not saying you're wrong.
You would think, first, the data doesn't exist regarding recipients. The last study was 1984 when I was born, for the two
No, I
scholars.
mean on the beliefs about who does
Oh, okay.
this.
So the
Yeah.
beliefs. So why did I go with how it's talked about? Just because I wanted to take mainstream discourse, but you're asking about empirical data
I'm asking
on those
empirically,
beliefs.
yeah.
That I haven't seen. That to confirm that most people believe this is who does the catcalling, for example, would be great. I think there should be any number of like new research on this, because like Hollaback, for example, focuses on people who are the recipients, mapping where they experience harassment, what kind of things they're hearing. They did an analysis of that, but I should attend to the stories that you mentioned. Once I remember who you're talking about, we will situate to your question about what is happening when black men harass women in this matter when they're responding to gentrification.
Who women they perceive
Right.
to be gentrifiers.
What's happening is linked violence. Several different types of violence is happening. The women are being racist. The men are being sexist.
Well, we don't know the women are being racist because they're just being harassed.
Well, right, but when women respond, often they respond with racism.
Yeah, I know, but you wrote that in. I didn't put that in the
Oh, okay.
question yet.
All right,
They're
so-
still being, they're being harassed. Now, they're being harassed just like we're back to the world of public perception.
Oh, okay.
They're being perceived as racist gentrifiers. They're not necessarily, we don't know that that's true, but it's a pretty good guess because they're walking, in the street,
Sure.
and the men make an assumption,
Yep.
which is probably a statistically valid assumption, though there's no
Sure.
reason to assume it's valid about that individual.
Right.
Does that mean that obviously it doesn't mean that they deserve the harassment?
No.
What is the proper response to that?
By the women or by me as a scholar?
Both.
Well, the proper response isn't a racist or classist one, that's
Right.
for sure. So let me give you
But
one.
we can agree on that.
Right,
What is
so when I was thrown against a grocery a month ago by a black man who said he wanted to kiss me, and I said no and moved away from him, he said, "It's because you hate black men." My response to that was that I am saying no as a perceived woman to a man who's being sexist in a country that does hate black men, and had a conversation sort of move as soon as my black wife called on FaceTime. He sort of shifted because she provided the racial validation, I guess, to his whatever. But what it does, why they use that, isn't because he really thinks I hate black men. It's just that it really shuts down the conversation.
Right.
Where do you even go from that when someone says that? And yet something occurred that was really threatening to me. And so I don't have a problem responding with the complexity, but other women would use that situation to reinforce their ideas about black men.
So, you know what, I want to jump back in here, because I feel like you've answered the question in ways that engage it at a higher level, but not that engage it in terms of the case development. And so
Okay.
I'm going to bring you, I'll bring up another question. And so I wrote the comments here. Actually, should I just move to the broader comments? Because it'll be all right. So I thought that this was a great dissertation. I
Thank you.
really enjoyed reading it, and it made me very happy to have had you in the ethnography class all those years ago when you started this. And it's really lovely to see the full thing here now. It's wonderful. I thought it makes a number of contributions. It illuminates things I've never thought about this. It engages a bunch of different literatures. It uses autoethnographic approaches in a really useful, convincing way. I thought the analysis of trans people's experience of catcalling and negotiating public space, of like passing but being erased, was really kind of pioneering. I mean, maybe I'm in the wrong fields and it's not pioneering, but it was pioneering to me, and I thought it was brilliant. So I think there's a lot of really awesome stuff here. I liked toxicity. Yeah. So. That was all good. But there's 2 or 3 issues, I think, and these are ideas of how do you make a dissertation into a book. And the reason I'm doing this circling back to this is I think if you do this, you'll fix one of the problems. So you'll either smile or grimace when I say this.
Sure.
Quotes are not cases, right?
Right.
You have a quote-itis problem in the dissertation. Right? There are 8,000 cases that are presented as quotes.
And you didn't even see some of the earlier ones.
Yeah. And so my first recommendation is going to be that you have fewer cases, but you actually develop them. No.
Oh, just
fewer
cases.
cases. You're going to have to cut a bunch of these quotes,
Sure.
no matter how much it's going to feel like you're cutting off.
Because it has to be 80,000 words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, because what happens is, like with this case, for example, with the 2 women that Phil and I were talking about, you basically dropped their quotes in and then said,
that's it.
and then you basically pivoted and said, but they're reinforcing the myth, and that's it. It was like really disrespectful in a way that you're not disrespectful to your informants in other places in the book. It wasn't intentional. There was no intent, but it basically was like, I don't like what they're saying. That was what it came off to me as. And
Okay.
but in the subsequent analysis, it comes out all the kind of stuff you talked about here, right? So with the gentrification and all that stuff. I think the thing to do is that these need to be like mini biographies. They need to be fuller cases.
Okay.
And the theoretical elements of your analysis need to be the parts of their biographies that get fully engaged. Because otherwise it's just quotes. It's sort of like, remember I talked in the class about the Shakespearean extra problem, where it's like theory singing, right? I've got a quote and I need someone to say this, and I drag them on stage and they say, these are the people that harass me, and you push them back off stage again, right?
Sure.
Your data is so deep, and you've done so much work, you could easily cut and I hate cutting stuff myself, right? But you could easily go to 1/3 the number of cases and just expand them into real cases instead of quotes. It'll be much more convincing. The other thing I think for the book is that we're going to want to get to know people over the course of the book. The way this is now, I'm like entirely overwhelmed. I don't care about any of the people by the end except, oh my God, this is all horrible, right? But in fact, you have the opportunity to develop in the reader real relationships with people, which the way you did with some of the cases,
I did,
right?
yes.
And so I think you should really. You are not leveraging all the ethnographic and other work you did to your full advantage here. And it's the good thing about this. The bad thing is you'll need to cut things. The good thing is it's going to make doing an awesome book easier. Because you'll have fewer cases and you'll develop them more fully.
Should I develop my own case, my own voice? Because
Yes, this is another point.
Like that.
So your autoethnographic stuff.
Much of it has been cut, by the way. There's much
No,
more.
but I also think. Well, I don't know. I mean, and you know, look, this is a dissert. Phil is your boss, and for another 50 minutes, and then and I'm just I'm one of the other people in the professorial chorus here, but you use autoethnographic method, but you never tell us why it's a legit method, right? Now I know I can see that your hackles raised when I said why is it a legit method. If they didn't, my hackles raised, right? But we always have to justify our claims for scholarly authority. I mean, if you're a quantizoid, everyone just assumes you know what you're doing because you have significance, right? I think that's dumb. But in qualitative work, you always need to justify your claims. You have awesome bases to make those claims, but you don't tell us them. For example, why is autoethnography the best way to do research on catcalling and everyday forms of violence, right? I'm just looking at what you did here. One of them is you're in situ. You know immediately what's going on. You know your own experience of it, and then you pivot and talk to the guys. So it's real time. You're doing situational interviews with the people that are doing it. Almost nobody ever does this. Almost always, everybody just interviews people and gets retrospective accounts of everything, and no one ever asks them questions. This is epistemically much stronger than most people. People say they're doing ethnography, but they really mean they're just doing interviews, right? So
Correct.
This is super strong. The other thing of this is when you say you're doing feminist ethnography, I know the idea there is that you're centering the stories of the people, and you're listening to them in a way that, and you're listening to non-hegemonic, non-male, whatever, right? Like people who are subaltern in some way. This all makes sense to me, but I think that framing is not necessarily as helpful as it was when it came out in the 70s, because there's a lot of mainstream ethnographers who do what you do and make the kind of claims I just said here, right? Look, I'm telling you what you did. You're epistemically in strategic sites, you're doing in situ brief interviews with people, you're following up cases. All of that is tremendously compelling, and it's not just I'm listening to the subjects and I'm a feminist ethnographer. These are the social science reasons. These are the epistemic reasons why I know what I know, and people that don't do what I do don't know these things. This is my contribution.
Yeah,
Or
I
one
mean,
of them.
I actually, the feminist ethnography part is more about me expressing my positionality and understanding the difference between me and my participants. So like my whiteness, my lesbianism, whatever. It's not just centering the voices. I just simply made a choice to interview more of those than of the catcallers.
You're missing the point. You're giving
That
me
is
a
broad.
political answer.
Wow.
I'm asking you for a scholarly intervention. What I'm saying is, how can you claim the scholarly authority that other people who do it the other way can't? You've done an awesome thing here, but you're not bragging about it the way you should be.
The way mediocre white men do about their projects.
That's not the way I want you to brag about it. I don't want you to brag like a mediocre white man. I want you to brag like someone who did several years of really good ethnography and knows these are the epistemic reasons why you're convincing. I want you to take yourself seriously this way as a scholar. I feel like the feminist ethnography framing, I know you're doing that, but I feel like it doesn't actually capture all the value you've added in a way, and it's easy to remedy. This is all you gotta do is tell us. Barbara, you
And I
wanted to
think,
chime
sure,
in.
if I may pick up on that a bit, I think that in that sense, because you have so much methodologically good reasons for explaining why you did what you did, simply saying, well, because it's feminist ethnography, when we talk about political, it comes off almost as it's too quick, it comes off as a cliche, it oversimplifies what you're doing.
Right.
And it makes it sound more like
It makes it like a political statement.
it makes it a political stance, and it makes a political stance that's easily dismissed. It's almost like
Well,
like you're
That
invoking.
doesn't make it wrong.
But that's the point. It's not about what you did. It's like I'm on this team, so I'm okay. And it's that's not. You've got so much more convincing stuff than that.
And I think that, like, the use of autoethnography, this is more of a deep participant observation
Yeah.
than
Yes.
autoethnography. Autoethnography, whatever, some of my best friends, but but I think this is
Yeah.
actually standard
Yeah.
sociology
Yeah.
done properly, in-depth interviewing and participant observation.
Right.
And by putting it in the boxes of autoethnography and feminist, you put it in the box it shouldn't be in, and you will just be cutting off your own audience.
You're picking enemies that you don't need. You're picking teams, and so some teams don't pay attention to other teams.
Right.
But your work is really good, and you don't need to say, "Don't bother me, I'm on that team." The other thing I would say,
It's also a shorthand. And
It's a
in
shorthand,
some sense,
yes.
it's a deceptive shorthand. Which if you unpack it more and unpack what you did, you avoid just using it as a quick shorthand that may or may not actually be indicating what you're doing.
the other thing, and are your friends the interpretive autoethnographers? I would think yes, right? Look at your face.
Quiet now, okay?
No,
I'm
so-
overtired and I will say the wrong
No,
thing.
and I will be, and now that I know you're friends, I'll be much more generous than I might have been otherwise, right? There's an interpretive school of this, and there's an analytical school of autoethnography.
Right.
The interpretive school looks at your own experience mainly as the object. The point is to excavate and interpret your own life. The analytic ethnography version of this is to use your experience as an ethnographer to analyze some object of analysis. The second one gets mainstream credibility. The first one gets marginalized. The way you're not making these claims, people are going to put you in the interpretive box, and then if you say, like, I'm a feminist ethnographer, and you don't say all this other stuff, you're going to be eliminating people who will take you seriously by the labeling, the signaling you're giving to the world. But you're also failing to take full credit for the really substantive work you've done. And that would be, if people don't like you because of your work, okay, you can live with that, right? But if you don't make the claims in a convincing way of why this is awesome work, you've let yourself down. That's what I meant by taking yourself seriously. As a sociologist, not with any adjectives attached to that. And I think this epistemic dimension, like what are the epistemic bases for you making these claims? You have like the strongest stuff, like most people just don't have this, right? And your project is perfectly suited to this. So I want you to brag about it.
Okay.
So, and we can meet later and talk about it. Did I send you the Alzheimer's paper one day?
Yes.
The autoethnographic one? I haven't published that, but that's the kind of thing I want you to do to lay out what's going on. Because I think it's awesome.
I'm going to take a guess and say that that's not going to be received as well as you think it's going to be. And
What?
that's because
The autoethnographic
doing what
thing?
you just said, and that's because one of Simone's big arguments is about linked violence. And in the conclusion of the dissertation, she links everyday violence on the street to a kind of violence that happens in the academy for people who don't do, who refuse to do or read work like hers. And so by not saying this is feminist ethnography, I think that's a good point. But I think you're firmly in, I work a lot with queer methods, I think you're firmly within a queer of color tradition that is about a methodology that is not general. And that if you pull back from that, what you're doing is maybe acceding to the violence before it's directed at you within the academy.
I don't
And
mean she
I have a
should pull
question.
back from it. What I mean is, like, if you pulled out every description of your methodology, right? If we didn't use any of those labels, this is completely kick-ass work. the fact that it has people, that it has like a queer, color, feminist orientation, political conviction, I don't think she needs to leave any of that out, but I don't think she needs to have any political dimension to the definition of to the making the argument of why this is really good work. So I'm not saying disavow the commitments you have. What I'm saying is don't fail to sell why it's really good sociological research that should be taken seriously, should be funded, should be tenurable, because most people can't do this kind of work, or at least don't do it. That's what so just to correct, I think.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have like,
Stuff to send me.
I have every chapter's marked up and and I'm like eco-friendly now. See, like there's no paper. It's all in there. I'm old school. I still don't have a Twitter account, but I don't use paper as much.
Because I'm thinking there needs to be some additional stuff because I'm not. I think all of you, I know you're gonna hate me, are dwarfing feminism to a much smaller thing than it is. What if feminism was mainstream sociology and I'm it? And so it actually is just synonymous. It's not synonymous to other people, but I don't think I can be, right, like
no, but here's the thing.
Political plus something else.
The feminist ethnography that you're invoking says we center the people and pay attention to them, and the old, like, white guys from the 70s, they don't care about people, they don't look at people, they just look at methods. Epistemologically, it's the bad methodology and the good methodology. I don't think that we're there now. I don't think you need to disavow the feminist ethnography part of it, like the whole Doris E. Smith and Stan, all that stuff made huge contributions. You can use it, but I think you need to tell us, why should we believe you? There's really good reasons, and you don't tell us that in using in the intro and then periodically throughout, like with the cases, right? You're going to develop these cases, so I want to know, like, for example, what would be super convincing. You got a key case. How long did you know this person? How many hours did you spend interacting? How many days did you spend with these guys? Some of them you knew, some of them you didn't, right? I thought that you quantified all this other stuff, the counting. I thought that was all entirely awesome, right? And it's kind of like the old bad guy, right? The statistical counting up, but it was really useful, right? I thought that was great. I worry that you're not making an epistemic argument. Why? How do I know what I know, and why should you believe me?
Okay.
And anyway, this is a longer discussion than necessarily it needed to be, but I'll send it to you. I had other issues, unless you guys want to talk about this more. No? All right. So the biggest thing then was you need more cases and not quotes.
Right.
You need to get rid of the case-itis, or quote-itis.
Yeah.
The other thing is that you need more theoretical setup and periodic theoretical intermissions in your exposition. I sometimes felt at the beginning of the chapters like I had come into a conversation in the middle of it, or like 20 or 30% into it, like everyone else knew what was going on, right? You and the guy, had, the woman, whoever you were talking to, I showed up late for the meeting, right? And as the other piece of this is you need cleaner theoretical empirical stories in the chapters. I get a sense in reading this that everything's related to everything, so how can anybody sort anything out, right? That's not going to be convincing. I know everything's related to everything, but you actually have really interesting
Examples.
You have not just examples, you have interesting empirical stories that emerge from the data that then tell a theoretical story, right? And I think you need to clean those up, and you just can't explicate everything in every case, all right?
One thing, and this is a book revision, not a dissertation revision, but one thing after you've celebrated and been happy about your achievement and actually got back on talking relations with your family and do your laundry and recover from this process, sometime a couple of weeks from now, is you should read the thing again from front to back in order.
Yes.
Which, first of all, that'll help you with the quote-itis, because you'll say, this is a wonderful quote, but there's 7 other quotes that make exactly the same point,
Right.
But secondly, to say, because there's so many variables going on in everything, right? is, okay, what is the point this chapter makes? What is the point this chapter makes? How does this relate back to the introduction?
Sure.
And what's repetitive? And that's really hard to do when you're in the midst of trying to get the thing done. But it would be very useful, I think, to go through that from one end to the other. So it's like, okay, here's a coherent story. And because it's complicated, that's going to take a lot of work to do. And sometimes you've got to, stand back and say, okay, which is a tangent, and which is in the flow.
Can I ask, so to do Rob's advice in the intro to then have a much clearer theoretical story that will get developed through each chapter's empirical
don't bury
story?
the lead. I feel like the theoretical insights, I ended up at the end of the chapter like, oh, that's what she's talking about, right?
They got a lead.
I mean, you don't have to like be pedantic about it, but slightly pedantic is not bad, because then you don't have to look, but say what the argument's going to be. The other thing is, you should set up a theoretical conversation, right? I mean, you go so quickly into the data and into the quotes. I don't know what the contribution is until the end. It's like reading a sentence in German. We have no idea what's going on until the absolute, it's like 5 minutes after you finish, right? You don't want that. You have actually, the material you have is so strong, you could do that in a different way. You could do it with a theoretical story up front. I saw Barbara or Phil, or were you going to jump in?
Just fairly standard, definitely for me, but for a lot of the dissertations and work with people over the years, it's pretty typical that you don't know what you're doing till you did it.
Yeah.
And so the end is actually what you need at the beginning. And that pretty much for me, almost always, whatever I give somebody to read, they say the end needs to be at the beginning. It's like, duh. Now, I'm old enough to sometimes recognize when I've done that, but not always. And I don't think reading it through yourself is necessarily the useful way to go. I think find some poor slob who hasn't read it at all yet, who owes you a favor. And could you just read this and help me figure out where to move things around? I think anybody who's read it over and over again doesn't remember, even if they're reading it again from the beginning, what showed up. So getting somebody else to read it is helpful. The other thing is to just lots and lots of subheads, put those out, and
Sure.
Some
Oh,
of
of
it's
course.
really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of...
The book will look quite different.
No,
I think,
it's not about that. It's about how to get you over on top of it, because you're still like in it,
Yeah.
and you need to be over. Okay, this is what I did. This is what I'm saying. And what you're clear on is this is the kind of world we ought to have. These are the people who are fucking it up. Here's what they ought to do. Nice. What you need to be saying is, I'm a sociologist. This is the kind of sociology. This is the topic that needs to be studied. These are the theoretical issues. Here's how I answer them. Ta-da!
Got it.
Here's
It's
why
a
my
very
work is
different-
more awesome than other people's work.
And Rob mentions the word pedantic. We try not to be pedantic. I have rarely found, this may seem like an overly caustic comment, but do not overestimate the intelligence of your readers, or particularly the dissertation committee. Tell them where you're going. Start out with, this is what I'm doing. Here are the flag posts. This
Make
is
it
what this
easy.
will say. Your book editor will tell you if you're repeating that and drilling that too much in.
I see.
But don't assume your reader is like inside your head and brilliantly, or that you can use a shorthand phrase and suddenly they'll know exactly where you're coming from. Play it out. There are
That
words.
sounds like a longer thing.
Yeah.
And then we're
Well,
also trying to cut
but
down.
we're cutting a lot of
It's
quotes.
case thing.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
you do cases instead of quotes,
Yeah.
you'll be able to develop this. And also the cases are not just
An assemblage of the facts in the person's life. It's a
Yeah.
theoretical, it's an empirical story, but it's a theoretical story, right? So for for the book, when you revise this as with more cases in it, it's going to force you to identify what are the theoretical elements that structure each chapter and the whole thing. And look, all three of us, I don't know your work, Matt, but I'm imagining it's the same. We've all been to exactly the point where this dissertation is like, wow, look at all this awesome stuff I have. I think I know what it means. And then but the story's not clear to everyone else, right? It's the difference between understanding and knowledge. Your understanding is deep here, but to make it knowledge that other people can easily grasp,
Got
it
it.
needs another work through. So,
Yeah, of course.
With signposts.
signposts are really
Because
useful.
your readers aren't that bright. They won't, they don't know everything you know. You gotta show them.
So I had two other points. I'm looking, it's 128 or something like that, right? So I'll make them quickly. One of them is that I think you have unengaged conflicts sometimes.
That I don't engage with. Or that
No, let me reframe that. You have apparent conflicts in the data that you don't actually engage and bring up much, right? So, like, one of the things is, in one part you're talking about how, people are saying the peers used to be safe and now the cops run us off, right?
Right.
And then you go into the LGBTQ, the trans religious chapter, one of those chapters, and you did this awesome exercise where they were like, tell me where you're safe and not.
Right.
And everybody said home is not safe, and everybody said the peer is safe. Right? So, and it doesn't, there's no like, gee, isn't that interesting? Like, it's like the one chapter and the other chapter don't know that they exist. And so, it's not that you're wrong in one of them, right? It's just that it needs more explication. And this idea, I think you're uncomfortable with anything that could possibly be construed to bring a harder policing hammer down on the heads of people of color, right? And so, like with the two women I talked about, with the two women who it's mainly black men in our neighborhood that are asking me, the problem is they don't, this is a bad metaphor. In this chapter, they're saying the peers are safe and their home neighborhoods are not safe, and you just kind of move on, right? This requires more explanation. And I feel like you're sometimes going to like a political belief shorthand. Like, I won't analyze that because it will end up that the cops will come in and arrest more black men. And you're not responsible. You're not going to call the cops, right? It's not that you shouldn't be aware of those things, but it looks like you're sort of like pulling the plug on the analysis, or that you're not paying attention to the analysis or the data as much as you might be. As much as how, because look how hard you work to get the data, right? So, and the other thing about this is, like, you have these elements. There are many ethnographic books that tell stories that are too clean, right? All the middle class people act one way, all the working class people act the other way, and you read one of these books and you go home and you're like, oh my God, I'm ruining my children, I'm acting the wrong way, or something like that, right? This is almost never how things work in real life. So you have, and so it's okay for people to say, you could have the same person saying the peer used to be great and now they're calling the cops on us, but then when they say where do you feel safe, they say the peer and not their neighborhood. But that needs explication, right? And that needs fuller,
The messiness of it.
It's messy and contradictory, and people can say different things at different times or feel different ways, but you need to explicate it, and you have to have a coherent narrative of something that could be incoherent.
Because human lives are.
Yeah, because so I think in some ways there's a political cleanness to your narrative that shuts down some of the analysis of the data in a way that's going to undermine your authority. And I think more analysis of it, in fact, would then be like, oh look, she's looking at everything. She's not pulling punches.
But by the way, just to throw out there, the question, however, about where do you feel safe, and the ironies of that. Some people feel safe in what other people think is a dangerous space was brilliant. That's that was a great question to bring in. And it really opens all things up, and so that's fabulous. Though I also agree with Rob that then when they give you an answer that is unexpected like that,
or that
you might have expected, but that a lot of your readers won't expect, then you gotta play with how is it that this apparently contradictory answer works.
And developing that is more consistent with the feminist ethnography commitment.
And if you really are respecting the informants, you'll fully explicate that. And I didn't read any intentional disrespect of anyone but oppressive people in the dissertation, right? But I think the fewer cases will allow you to give the more full attention.
I agree. Yeah. Okay.
So
wow.
I had one final comment here. And this one is, so I was thinking about, on the way in this morning, I was thinking about, because this is actually two comments. One of them is, it's entirely awesome that you quantify stuff and count it. It's entirely awesome that you're talking very confidently about the public health consequences of this, or the because most of us just, it's like usually the conclusion of most social science qualitative dissertations are, until we get major structural change about everything, we're all doomed, right? Which is really grim and not useful, right?
Actually, the usual quantitative answer is this means that we need more research.
But you're actually like, no, we can actually do stuff about
Yes.
this.
Right.
So in the book, I really want you to like develop that more. And the public health angle, that's a place where there's money and nobody can be against public health. It's like kissing babies, right? And so if you're like against police harassment, well, the police won't like that. But nobody can be like, oh, we want more unhealthy people. So the public health, like education, it's a sweet spot. I love that dimension of the work. It's not developed, but I can hear in your comments, it's like something you could really do.
Yeah.
All right. Last thing then. So I was thinking about who else does work like this, and I was thinking like Nikki Jones is not. I don't
That's
see
right.
her.
She's one of my. Oh, you don't see her, but she's top 3 reviewers for the book.
I don't care about that. I
Well,
don't
so
see her in the
that-
book.
she
I
and I
mean,
are
it is
talking.
good. It's great that she's a reviewer, but her work and her
Oh yeah,
mentors.
and by the way, she's a reviewer in the book. You
Yeah.
definitely
Her mentor.
need
No,
to
but
have her beside
look,
it
I was
more
thinking
often.
about who else does urban violence, right? So Nikki's
Doug Meyer, who graduated from
Nikki's not in there,
a couple of days ago.
and
A couple
Eli
of days.
Anderson's not in there, right?
Wow.
You cite him once.
No.
Yes.
You do.
He's in there,
Which I
but
was
there's no
pleased.
conversation
Yes.
with him.
Okay. Thanks.
You know what?
Not a huge fan.
That's not a good enough answer.
Sure, I'll
Every
engage
single
more.
reviewer will say, why isn't she talking to him? And
Sure.
if your answer is, he's got like such a toxic gender lens that I couldn't stand reading him, that's not a great answer, but you can frame it more nicely.
In a nicer way, yeah, 'cause I read
Yeah,
that.
you need to have a conversation with him because he is one of the guys that set out what the rules of urban interaction are.
Yeah.
And what about like, Tally's Corner and those guys? You
Right,
need
right,
to
right,
have
right.
a conversation with those guys, and if they're all wrong and horrible, that's great, but they're not entirely stupid. There must be some insights, right? I'm being
and by the way, just as a purely instrumental aside, if Nikki Jones is one of the
Yeah,
reviewers
you gotta
for your
cite.
book, not only obviously you have to cite Nikki Jones,
No,
but you definitely have to cite Eli because Eli is her mentor. And she will,
And her
the first thing
patron.
and I happen to
Yeah.
know, the first thing she will say is, why didn't you cite Eli? Now you can disagree with Eli. Nikki disagrees with her on all kinds of stuff,
It's a
but you
glaring
can't
omission.
ignore her.
Yeah.
Got it.
But you don't have to say, you don't have to agree with them.
Yeah. But you can't act like he's not there.
You can't ignore somebody who's been influential on your.
I
exact
certainly
thing.
ignored Michael Kimmel and his stuff on toxic masculinity, so I did a good job there.
Yeah, you're probably going to get
You
somebody.
should-
That's
you-
fine.
you
That
need
I
to
will
talk
not
to, you know what?
Seat
No,
on.
You should be talking to the people
Yeah.
that you think are wrong. If you don't, then it looks like you haven't read
Yeah.
them. And,
And
you don't
frankly,
know.
Correct.
I don't
Yeah.
think you
I
need
have,
Kimmel in here. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
okay.
really no reason
Yeah.
why you would. But Anderson,
Street violence and
Denier,
threats of
I
violence,
mean,
all that stuff
they're
is-
they're
is
they're
really
on
important.
point. And where you disagree, you should say where you disagree.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what else you might think about? Philippe Beaubois and his book In Search of Respect.
I teach it in urban social.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the total lack of a gender lens there, even though he
Yeah.
claims that there is one.
Well,
Yeah.
by having a wife.
Yeah.
Speak Spanish. I read that book thoroughly.
That
But the
is-
lack of a
you're right.
substantive gender lens in that book would be one of the, if you were going to make a point.
Yeah.
Right? Prior work on urban violence. I mean, it's really good ethnography, right? He has certain, and placing it all in deindustrialization as the cause of everything.
He does a good structural analysis.
He's an
I think.
awesome ethnographer. He just didn't have the proper theoretical lenses in certain parts of the analysis.
Sure, sure.
And
we
you
can-
say that.
Yeah, but you can
Anyway.
say that, and then you're taking him seriously. You're taking yourself seriously by engaging with people you disagree with, and that will really be. You have a lot to say.
Barbara has a class, and we've been at this quite some time, so I think we should probably adjourn. One, and I will obnoxiously assert the chair's prerogative by making one last point, which is small but kind of a writing thing.
Okay.
You sort of assume that the stereotype that everyone has of catcallers is black. Well, that's true too. That's a more important point. But you think of it as people of color, as African American and Latino men, and then kind of in a almost
Yeah, the
Frost did
construction
it the
workers,
last minute, construction
not the
workers.
side word, the
And
side
construction
word.
workers. You know, now of course, construction workers stereotypically in New York are white. And yet construction workers in New York are stereotypically the ultimate, you know, harasser. We always, when we think, you ask most people that I know about sexual harassment, they'll immediately start talking about construction workers, which is to say white, lower middle class men. And you throw class in at various points. You say
Yeah.
race, people of color, and communities, and class. You know,
Right.
and construction workers.
But you don't really mean
But
it.
you don't really, it doesn't, your analysis doesn't have much of that.
I'm not convinced you mean it.
Yeah, it's almost like it's, you know, all right, yeah, construction workers too. But of course, that's, you know, where the stereotype really is. So I think you gotta say a little more about that.
The slightly going along with that, the slightly odd thing is the education level of your interviewees
Right.
is very high.
Exactly.
Of the recipients, yeah.
The recipients is very high, and I just wonder
Yeah,
if
I
you're
wrote that
quieting
down.
class in that way too.
Yeah, I need to
No.
engage
Yeah.
with that more.
Well, it's also, with the construction worker thing is also, a lot of the harassers you talk to turn out not to be working class, right? And there is that kind of sense that the world, you know, is more complicated than that, and that there's actually a condoning of this by people who are in positions of wealth
Correct.
and power,
Yes,
right?
Yes.
But, in fact, the people who are actually doing it, an awful lot of them are upper working class white men. And to some extent, that's
Right,
kind
they
of
are
where a
the
stereotype
second
is.
most likeliest group in my
Yeah,
sample.
exactly, but you don't talk about it
But
very
that
much.
just gets, it's small.
Yeah,
that
no, I
part.
understand that it's not there,
Yeah.
but since that's so prominent in the stereotype, I think you have to address it.
I bet there's work on the, because the thing I would actually, to push Phil's point a little bit, I think we need to have some
Sense of the types of harassers in the universe of harassers, right? Because you keep saying, oh, everyone thinks it's just black men or black and Latino men, and like the construction workers, right? You mentioned at one point like Wall Street guys, which I could totally
Yeah.
see,
Right.
right? So, but I don't know. I want to know a little bit more about this because you're asserting that there's this belief,
And they aren't the stereotype.
yeah.
Who did you meet in the park when you started? Who were those people?
Black poor men.
So then the thing to say is like this is why this is. I mean, look, if it's black poor men, and then all the people that you're interviewing are the people that were harassed by these guys, like it's like you're on the dependent variable entirely, right?
Well, no, the people I talked to weren't harassed just by them. They
Oh,
were
I see.
harassed in New York City.
right, but in New York City, who are the people who are gonna be doing this, right?
Well,
Construction
so yeah,
workers
yeah.
and poor minority men, and most men in the places they live are gonna be minority, right? So it's, like, I think there's easy ways to explain this without always going, like, there's this horrible myth. It's actually, it could be like an empirical reality and among the informants that you interviewed.
Yes.
And it doesn't, you know, like, you should fight back against the myth, but you're sort of undermining yourself sometimes
Okay.
by not just explaining, this is why my numbers are like this.
Right.
You
I
do
think
a
I
little
just
bit,
gave
but-
one sentence or two
Yeah.
as to black men being the number one group because, like, of who the recipients are being mostly of color, and so it's due to segregation and proximity. But I can,
Yeah.
right, like, actually engage with that material.
Yeah, and again, my white construction workers are just totally missing
That's
in the
what I would
analysis,
see more
even though
of
they're
that.
the second biggest group.
Yeah.
Well,
I
so
see
they're
more
not
of
all
that with
construction
the
workers.
others.
Yeah,
Well,
okay,
or
got
people
it.
perceived
Yeah.
as. Again, we're in that. That's what's great about this. Is all we're in the as people
Perception.
are perceived as, and that's true on the part of the victims too.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
have to
Yeah, we have
adjourn
to
quickly.
adjourn.
Okay.